Welcome to the LongCovidPodcast with me, Jackie Baxter. I am really excited to bring you today's episode. Please do check out the links in the show notes where you can find the podcast website, social media and support group, as well as a link to buy me a coffee if you are able. You should not rely on any medical information contained in this podcast and related materials in making medical, health-related or other decisions. Please do consult a doctor or other health professional. I love to hear from you. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or just want to say hey, then please do get in touch. I really hope you enjoy this episode, so here we go. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Long COVID podcast. I am super excited to be joined today by Dr. Meg Anderson, and we are going to be talking about movement, which is somewhat controversial. So here we go. A very warm welcome to the podcast today.
Great. Thank you, Jackie. I am beyond excited to be here today and even more excited to dive into this controversial topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you just say a little bit about yourself and what it is that you do?
So I think it's helpful to understand a little bit about where I come from to lead up to what I do. So as you introduced me, my name is Dr. Meg Anderson. So my background is a doctorate of physical therapy. That's what my degree is. That's my profession by trade. At this point, I have over 10 years of experience. And, the funny thing is, 10 years ago, after I just graduated, you told me I was going to be a long COVID rehab specialist. I would have looked at you and said, what's that? What are you talking about? Even if you asked me that question 4.5 years ago, I would have said, okay, what's that? Right. And yet here I am. I've completely dedicated my entire physical therapy career to long COVID. And how I got here is a little bit unique in the sense that in 2020, I had made the transition within my own health system. I used to work in the hospital-based system and physical rehab setting. And I made a transition to what I thought was my dream job. I really was like, I'm going to retire here. This is going to be great. And we all know what happened, 2020, dun, dun, dun. So I, in a matter of days, weeks, went from being a staff physical therapist to a frontline healthcare worker. I'm located on the East Coast of the United States. So we surged very early. Where I am physically located, we surged like 2 to 3 weeks after New York became the epicenter. I was just thrown in. And being one of the youngest PTs on staff, I volunteered to be designated as like the COVID physical therapist, meaning anyone who came into the hospital or rehab that was COVID positive, I would be the one who would see them. And I, did that to save some of my older colleagues who at the time, were high risk. And because of sheer curiosity, I'm like a moth drawn to a flame. Everyone's saying run away. And I'm like, please let me get closer. But, what this ended up being was an experience where I spent months and years geared up head to toe in personal protective equipment, working with some really, really sick individuals. And then the people that I got to see were the ones who survived, right, is what we're talking about. And so it was kind of like, hey, we saved them, you go fix them. And I was like, I've never worked with anything like this before. What am I supposed to do? Am I going to help them? Am I going to hurt them? Like, what are the rules here? And I started digging in and doing a ton of research and just going with the experience. And it was interesting. As I was working with these individuals in the hospital, we were seeing a lot of weird things, things that were not the normal trajectory. And, it had me start putting some dots together. And then as time went on later in 2020, we started realizing that the people who we were sending home from the hospital weren't getting better. And then we realized that there were people in the community who weren't getting better. And there was just something about this where I already had a slight, maybe more than slight, disdain for the healthcare system and its ways that it helps people. And I think this just really pushed me over the edge in being passionate and realizing that the system is overwhelmed and there are too many people who are going to be left behind, and I have to do something. And so in 2021, I completely pivoted, and I started my own virtual practice working with people who were recovering from COVID, and I started my COVID recovery program. And then since there, I phased myself out of the hospital, where I'm at the point that I no longer work in the hospital system, which is amazing, but I also wish that we weren't in this position either. So that's kind of led me to where I am today. I'm taking my knowledge, my skill set, and from working in the hospital system, the rehab system, having worked with a variety of conditions across decade, and applying it to what we're seeing today with long COVID.
Yeah, and it's amazing how people are using existing skill sets or developing maybe existing skill sets into working in this world. And it's quite interesting because, long COVID obviously itself is quite new. 4 years isn't that new, but it is kind of in terms of medicine and research. But conditions like long COVID, the precursor to long COVID, maybe even, things like ME/CFS have been around for, I don't know, decades and decades. And I suppose, yeah, it's kind of a frustration in some ways, isn't it, that there hasn't been more done in that world, but also kind of joining together dots from the stuff that has been done. Because I think certainly, one of the things I have realized is that, there's loads of people really kind of enthused with long COVID research and long COVID, developing protocols for all of this and stuff, which is wonderful. But actually, there's a lot of other stuff that came first that we should also be kind of listening to and reading and connecting with. So we're not reinventing the wheel, I suppose. And interestingly, that you were working in this world kind of beforehand. So maybe you're able to do that.
Yeah, so the interesting piece is that in 2019, right before all of this came to fruition, I had started to teach myself about dysautonomia and POTS. I had come across two patients within the rehab setting, and there was just so many things about this that didn't make sense. And I then realized what was going on. And then I said, what is this? I didn't learn about this in school. I need to learn more. And so I had already had this foundation and interest in something that we didn't even know was coming, basically, right? We know now that looking at COVID as a whole, about 10 to 30% will convert to long COVID. Okay. And then out of that, of those who convert to long COVID, minimum 2/3 are going to develop POTS. Okay. Every time I check this, it's as if the statistic goes up higher and higher. So I had already had this foundation. It was already kind of on my brain. And then I jumped right into this and I was like, whoa, wait a minute. This looks like something that I was just learning. Oh my gosh, nobody else is going to catch on to this. This is not something that's taught in schools. This is not something that is really well managed. And again, that was that push again, like I need to go do something about this. I need to tell people that this is what's going on. So there was that element, but then also working in rehab, I loved working with conditions that were neurological in base, and with COVID, there's a lot of neurological signs and symptoms. So it was like all these worlds that I loved and were learning were colliding into one condition. And again, like you said, this is not all new. COVID, long COVID is new, but post-viral illness is not. And again, I think we need to look at COVID is the catalyst and the trigger, And what we're really talking about is an umbrella term of many conditions that are being triggered. And long COVID is not just one thing, right? And that there are many versions. So it was just interesting how I could take all that knowledge and end up where I am now. But I would say I feel like I went to school again the last 4 years. Seriously, I almost had to unlearn everything I learned. I mean, granted, like I had a solid foundation, but what we're taught in school as physical therapists, what we learn to own and apply for rehabilitation is just not what works with this population. I mean, we're taught, principles that are based off of training with overload principles, that in order to build muscle, we have to train at 60 to 80% one rep max. That's not happening in this population, and that in order to correct deconditioning, we need to hit certain target heart rate zones. Well, again, that's too aggressive in this population. And so I really had to go back to school and teach myself, okay, then what is going to work here? Everything I've known is going to be dangerous. I'm at risk of causing more harm than good. So to say that I've gone to school all over again is maybe an understatement in some ways.
Yeah, and in the same way that, when you develop something like long COVID, you have to totally relearn your own body and your own nervous system and, everything about yourself. It's kind of like the flip side of that as a practitioner, you're having to sort of relearn principles, in order to kind of understand the condition. And I suppose this is why the traditional medical model finds that difficult because, as you say, most doctors, GPs, health practitioners in general don't actually learn about things like dysautonomia, or if they do, it's such a kind of mention at the bottom of a page kind of thing. So doctors generally don't understand it. So they don't know what to do. And, doctors will react in different ways to that, some of which are more harmful than others. But, I think fundamentally it's a complete lack of understanding. And, in some ways you can't blame doctors for that because how can you expect them to understand something that they've never been taught? And as you say, yeah, that's why we kind of have this problem. And we've got people who are now working, I suppose, more outside the traditional medical model like you and I. And that's why we're having the success that we are, I suppose, because we're able to work outside of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean the medical model, we could argue about what the perfect medical model is all day and night, but the truth of the matter is that the model is meant to fix things. It's not meant to manage things. And when it comes to long COVID, right, and I'm gonna continue using that umbrella term, long COVID, again, knowing that it really means different conditions that are triggered by the COVID virus. So when it comes to long COVID, it really comes down to being managed, not being fixed. And I don't want people to confuse the word fixed with recovery, okay? Different topic. We'll table that for right now. So this piece where the quote unquote traditional medical system is operating off of, well, we need to find something that's broken in order to fix it. And when we're talking about dysautonomia, POTS, ME/CFS, autoimmune triggered conditions, oftentimes they're not going to fall under the traditional standardized testing of do this, then that, then do this, then that. And so it gets missed, right? And the thing is, it's not hard to figure it out. They're just not using the right tests, right? And so that was some of what I left the hospital to go do, is to give people answers, to give people clarity, because what's really unique about physical therapists is that we're trained in this way where we can see a person as a whole being and see how everything relates to each other. We don't have to narrow in as a specialty in the sense of like a cardiologist only looks at one organ, your heart. A pulmonologist looks at your lungs, a nephrologist looks at your kidneys. When you're working with a physical therapist, we get to take a step back and see the whole picture, and a lot of these conditions under the long COVID umbrella are whole body systemic conditions, right? And they are relative to movement, and they're relative to changes in position, which is kind of what physical therapy are the experts at. We're the experts of movement. And so there are screening tools and there are ways to really identify this and help people. And then the way physical therapy is structured, we're not a one-off fixer. We're meant to have a relationship with people and help manage things, right? But then I think there's, unfortunately, again, like I said, I had to unlearn a lot of what the principles I learned, right? And so I think, unfortunately, there are individuals who do end up in physical therapy, which is, I believe, the best place you can be, except this is not common knowledge yet, right? And so we've ended up with people who have either gone backwards or just not made progress, unfortunately. And again, I think it's because of some of the principles that I've carried forward. When I was in the hospital setting and trying to figure this out, what we were seeing is, as we all thought initially, a heavy respiratory virus, right? And then what we were ending up seeing in the hospital was this huge cytokine storm. So cytokine meaning like a large inflammatory reaction. And I was looking and thinking, okay, well, I have to treat the respiratory piece. This is a respiratory condition. Okay, got it. So what can I do? I can do breath training. Beautiful. Okay. All right. Now, what about this cytokine storm? Is there something non-medical that I can do to help this person? When I say non-medical, I mean like pharmacology in terms of a medication. Okay. And this led me down a rabbit hole of trying to learn, like, okay, what is really a cytokine storm? Well, it's a ton of inflammation. Okay, well, what triggers a ton of inflammation? Well, when the system's in overdrive, when we're in fight or flight. Well, what is that? Oh, that's sympathetic. Okay, got it. I'm bringing back some of the stuff I learned. Well, what's the opposite of that? How do we fix that? Well, we have to get the body back into parasympathetic. Well, how do I do that? Oh, okay, vagus nerve, right? Okay. And then it's, well, how do I activate it? Oh, so here's all these techniques. How do I monitor it? Oh, HRV, and so it was just, this is how I started learning from within the hospital, seeing these medical conditions and then taking these principles and applying it to the community, right? And then now I even teach physical therapists how to do this and how to recognize it. So, I mean, it's been an incredible journey.
Yeah, and I think what's so great is that you were so curious about it and wanting to find out how you could help these people. And, that there must have been some element of trial and error, but it sounds like, you were just trying so aware of what could happen if you were to do too much that, you kind of understood that, I suppose, to the point where you kind of worked it out, which I suppose what we're going to dive into a load of today. So circling back to kind of movement, I prefer the word movement rather than exercise. I don't know, you maybe have thoughts on that, but I think exercise has sort of connotations. But anyway, whatever you want to call it, whether it's gentle movement, exercise, whatever. Why is this important in anyone, but particularly in recovery, I suppose?
Well, I'm going to say the big E word. I'm going to say exercise, Jackie, mostly because that's just what's going to roll off my tongue. But we can get into that a little bit more. I think to understand the importance of exercise and movement in this population, we have to understand a little bit about some of those umbrella conditions. So I think the easiest way is to take dysautonomia in POTS, since it is the largest cohort, and not to dismiss anyone else who experiences a different version of long COVID, but just for this example. So with dysautonomia in POTS, typically, we're talking about a condition where there is hypovolemia, so less fluid volume, right? Or there are different versions of POTS, but typically there's some type of pooling effect, right? The body's not doing its job against gravity, okay? Every single human being on this earth, when they go to stand up, our body goes through this process of gravity takes over, the fluid volume in our vessels drops down as a reaction. And then we have these really cool reflexes in our body that counteract and correct that in a matter of seconds that we don't even notice. We don't even know this is happening, but it happens every single time. Like, it's a beautiful thing. But what happens in dysautonomia and POTS is that cycle, those reflexes, that returning the fluid volume doesn't happen in a timely manner. So we end up with symptoms like dizziness, lightheadedness, brain fog. And then again, it's not just about whether you're passing out or not, because you have to think the fluid is pooling below the level of the diaphragm. Well, what sits below your diaphragm? All your other organs, right? So that's why we get abdominal symptoms, GI symptoms, so many other symptoms, right? And it's a whole body effect. Well, the correction to that is we need to restore the normal mechanisms, meaning we need to retrain the body to respond appropriately against gravity. Okay. Now, there are a few ways you can do that, but muscles are one of the ways that pump fluid up, right? That's one of their jobs. And so by doing some type of activity, movement that either maintains or improves the health of your muscles is going to help counteract that effect. So when you help counteract that effect, you have less symptoms. Okay. These symptoms, a lot of times people say, like, oh, I have chest tightness, or I feel a band around me, or my heart starts racing really fast and I get palpitations. And the thing is, it's not your heart that's the problem. It's that your body is having a full-blown reaction to this stress, right? This planned stress of being upright. Okay. So again, it comes back to needing to train the mechanisms to help correct that. Now, we talked about the muscles, right, which milk and pump them up. The other piece is that this is a nervous system problem, right? The nervous system is not telling the body to do these normal reflexes. It's having a very abnormal, haywire response. Exercise, movement, is a way to help train the nervous system again, to teach it how to respond appropriately. So this is why it's important, and there are many other ways to train the nervous system. This is just one of those components. Okay. So it's what can help with kind of giving you the end game, right? I talk about a lot of times with people, there's a lot of things you need to do in the interim to help you feel better, right? Like wearing compression, great. Increasing hydration, great. But it's not the end game, right? You really need to restore the normal function of the system. So it comes down to that exercise is a component of correcting the nervous system and helping restore those mechanisms.
Yeah. I mean, we've got like the physical, actual muscle bit where the muscles are physically able to pump that blood or stop that pooling, to support the body effectively. But also the effect on the nervous system, which is also huge. And, these things are so connected, aren't they, as well? But I think, if you're able to get outside, you've also got these massive mental health benefits from that as well. Even if it's just to sit in your garden, I think that must be absolutely huge for people that, haven't been able to do that. But yeah, I mean, I suppose the sort of controversial bit here is I think many people with long COVID, and I'm sure the same for ME/CFS and other conditions, where they tried to exercise their way out, or they tried to push themselves too hard, or what turned out to be too hard, and made things worse. And I certainly am in that category. I tried to do exercise, and guess what? It didn't work. So we know that if we push ourselves too much, then that doesn't work. So how can we do this in a safe way that doesn't make things worse, that doesn't bring on things like post-exertional malaise, that doesn't send us backwards into crashes and everything, but in a way that does support the body, that does support the nervous system? So I suppose that's the question, isn't it? How do we find that balance? We'll be right back. I'm interrupting myself for a second to tell you about long COVID breathing. The fabulous Vicky Jones and I have teamed up to bring you long COVID breathing. We are both passionate about sharing our expertise and experience of the breath and how incredibly helpful that can be with long COVID. We've worked together to develop a course that is specifically tailored to those with long COVID. It's a 6-week course with 12 sessions, all delivered online. The community feel and learning that we're all sharing is such a joy. To find out more information and to sign up for our courses, workshops and other shorter sessions, please check out the link below, longcovidbreathing.com, or email longcovidbreathing@gmail.com to start your breathing journey with us.
Yeah. So I think the best way to actually talk about this is not so much about how to find the balance, but how to understand when you're ready for that. Because yes, we can absolutely talk about the balance, because in that case, we're talking about how do you actually exercise, right? And I think what we need to talk about first is how do you know when you're ready? And, with me, like I said, in terms of how I started out, my foundation that I brought forth was mainly breath training, right? Because even though people don't end up with respiratory symptoms as their main complaint, most do experience some shortness of breath, but usually it's because, I've exerted, right? And I get out of breath. So they don't think of this as a respiratory condition. But what I could see was that no matter what version of long COVID somebody had, there was breathing dysfunction. And breathing drives the nervous system, right? The autonomic nervous system is what we're talking about here. And it's a two-way street between, the brain and the diaphragm, okay? So for those who don't really understand the autonomic nervous system, basically it's the part of our nervous system that controls things all automatic, right? So our heart rate, our blood pressure, tear production, sweat, even sexual function, blood pressure, anything that we can't voluntarily control is what it controls. We don't say, hey, body, can you start sweating, right? We don't say that. We don't have voluntary control. It just happens. And the thing is, the diaphragm, breathing, is one of those things. Now, the interesting thing is it's a two-way system in the sense that when we are in fight or flight, right, sympathetic, let's say, we're essentially designed from our ancestors to run from danger. So, you know what? There's a dinosaur chasing after us. We need to run away. We need to breathe harder. We need to breathe faster. We need to be in fight or flight. Totally normal, right? However, if you're not in danger and your breathing is dysfunctional and it's really fast, it's going to drive your nervous system into fight or flight. It's going to make your brain think you're in danger and in fight or flight and trigger all these other things, right? So when it comes to figuring out when am I ready to exercise, the things that I focus on first is stability. You need to be stable, right? So that means kind of medical stability. I firmly believe that I will not guide anyone to do any form of exercise until they've corrected their breathing dysfunction. Because more often than not, I find that people have a really high respiratory rate. And if you have a high respiratory rate at rest, it's only going to get higher with exercise. And so you're almost further feeding into the breathing dysfunction instead of actually helping it. So there's a few things that I say need to be kind of managed as like a preconditioning phase before you can exercise. So we've talked about breathing dysfunction, right? So you need to correct that, meaning that you have a lower respiratory rate. Normal is 6 to 20. You want to be closer to 6, so 6 breaths per minute. That you have adequate control of your diaphragm, which is the main breathing muscle. It's not the only one, but it's the main breathing one, that you have adequate control. That's important. So breathing dysfunction, metabolic needs are met. So meaning your diet, that you are hitting your metabolic needs, your calories, your protein, your macros and your micros, because you are otherwise operating at an energy deficiency. And if you then add on exercise, you're going to go even further into a deficiency, right? So we have the meeting your metabolic needs through diet, being medically stable, right? Because there are plenty of elements out of long COVID that are not medically stable. And one of them being mast cells, right? So you need to have a little bit of a handle on your mast cells. Not to say that it's going to be entirely gone and entirely perfect before you start exercising, but you need to have a better understanding and handle on it, because exercise is inflammatory, right? And we can talk about that a little bit more, that it's good and bad inflammation. But so medical stability, and then having a true understanding of balance and recovery strategies, right? I think those things are key, and that is what I look for in a person before I say, okay, yes, you're ready. So that's extremely important. And Jackie, you know what? This has led me to kind of create my own acronym that helps me manage something that otherwise is really complex and abstract, right? This is not how we approach most patients in physical therapy. Most patients in physical therapy are quote unquote relatively healthy, right? In the sense that they're meeting their metabolic needs. They don't have a breathing dysfunction. They, most likely aren't medically unstable, So the acronym I came up with is RV camping. It's a little funny. It's a little funny, but bear with me here. So we have respiratory, vagus reset, consistency, activity modification, monitoring, pacing and positioning, intake, normalizing flexibility, grounding, and gratitude, right? So all of these give you like an area that needs to be addressed as part of your healing, and also kind of before getting to exercise. It's so crucial that your body is ready to handle it. And I think that's where a lot of the controversy comes from, is because there is a lot of truth in evidence from the research and from lived stories that exercise has helped people. So we can't deny that. Except what happens is there is also lived truth and experience that exercise harms people in this population, and in the ME/CFS world. And unfortunately, I think what happens is people want so badly to be validated on either side of the aisle that they just want to be heard and to feel as if, a certain narrative isn't going to get pushed on someone else. And I understand that. I do. I think it's important that we acknowledge that there's such a spectrum here, and that I do believe that exercise or movement, however you want to look at it, is important and can be beneficial, but it comes down to, are you using it when you're actually ready for it? And I think a lot of people are not ready for it, which is why it gets a bad rap.
Yeah, so it's like so many things that, yes, it can be extremely helpful, but it's got to be done in the right way at the right time. And, kind of understanding what's going on with your body as you do it, I suppose, coming back to that body awareness. And this is so much of what I talk about when I talk about breathing. You've got to do the right breathing exercises at the right times. Because if you try and do something that's too hardcore, then the body is going to get worse. And, oh, well, breathing doesn't work. And it's like, well, in that way, it doesn't actually, but it's very personal to every person. And I'm sure this is the same with movement. What one person is capable of is going to be wildly different to what someone else is capable of. And that's going to be partly to do with their body. And I suppose partly to do with their preference as well, in terms of what movement do they actually resonate with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that gives me a slightly different perspective is because since my background mainly comes from the hospital-based setting and the rehab setting, I've worked with people who are in the ICU where exercise for them is rolling over in bed. And that's what we would do with people, or just sitting up at the edge of the bed, even if it took 3 of us to hold that person up, was their exercise for the day, So I think I have a different understanding that the threshold needs to be so much smaller. And I think the other piece of this is that as a society and culture, our belief of what exercise is and should be is a little bit warped. I think we think that you have to be, feeling the burn and sweating profusely and going to failure, the point of failure where you can't do another rep, for it to be exercise and for it to be beneficial. And that's just not true. It's just not true. I mean, this is a relative tangent, but when we look at blue zones, which are high density population areas of people who live to 100 or over, right, of centenarians, the main pillars of how these people got to over 100 is by eating well, connection, moving naturally, and having a purpose in life, right? These people aren't doing high intensity interval training. They're not doing Ironmans. They're not doing marathons, but they move naturally, right? And so I think there's a lot of value in understanding that how you may have exercised before is not how you have to or should exercise now with long COVID. And, for people who have been more inactive or sedentary, housebound, homebound, whatever, for 18 months plus, we're talking about we're 4 years going on the beginning of 5 years, and there's people who have been dealing with this for 4 years already. Your threshold is so much lower, right? You have to think of, if you were in the hospital for that long, it would be so easy to understand and wrap your head around how weak and how low the threshold is. But because, it's happening in your home and it was like an overnight thing, it's so different to understand that the threshold is so much lower.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as you said, in the ICU, movement for people could be rolling over in bed. And for some people with long COVID, that is more than enough for some of them. So it's like you say, the threshold is going to be very different for everybody. And I suppose that's what partly makes it difficult, because it's not like you can say, right, well, everyone with long COVID needs to start by rolling over in bed 3 times, because that's going to be completely different for all sorts of people. Like, that just doesn't work. So it's posed frustrating for people when they're saying, all right, what do I do? But it's an impossible question to ask. Now, just backtracking a moment, because you said about exercise being inflammatory, but we also talk about exercise being something that helps to reduce inflammation. So how does that balance out?
Yeah, actually, it's a pretty simple, straightforward answer, in the sense that exercise is a form of planned stress on the body, right? And, stress doesn't have to be, oh, I have a deadline, right? Stress is just anything that comes, as exertional or out of the norm to the body. And so anything that does that usually creates some form of inflammation. And it's a very natural and normal response that with exercise, there is some temporary inflammation created within the muscles, and then our body flushes it out. And in the long term, it helps us actually reduce our overall systemic inflammation from a long-term standpoint, right? So when we're talking about people who have mast cell sensitivity, your threshold and your sensitivity is very low. And I say low, meaning that it doesn't take much to trigger a very large response. And if your body is not in the position to be able to flush out that excess inflammatory response, then of course exercise is going to trigger feeling unwell, right? And so that's why I talk about how important it is to have some medical stability before introducing exercise/movement.
So it's that short-term inflammatory response. So it's stress up to stress down, isn't it, effectively? Cool. So, I mean, we've talked about how, there isn't a set protocol. You can't say, right, follow this list and you will get better. And you've talked about the importance of that stability before introducing movement. And I can make sure that a link goes to that in the show notes if anyone's trying to remember all of the things from the acronym. But do you have any kind of sort of general do's and don'ts, maybe red flags to look out for? And I suppose this is a really, really big question, but how to know how much to do.
We'll be right back. Hey there, I'm just jumping in for a second to see if you're enjoying this episode. If you're finding it useful, maybe you would consider sharing it somewhere, a friend, a group, or even on your Twitter feed. If everyone was able to share just once, we'd be able to get this information out to even more people who really, really need it. So please consider sharing somewhere if you possibly can. I hope you enjoy the episode, and thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm going to be honest, there's no simple way to answer it, again, because there's so many nuances. I think the best way for me to answer it is maybe through an example. So, I had someone that I worked with, young gentleman, 30 years old, who prior to this was entirely active, playing soccer, powerlifting, running his own business, like doing all the things that, a 30-year-old should be doing. And then, COVID hit, long COVID came as a result. And, we started working together. And what people don't realize is that often they have to scale back before they can go forward, right? And I think of it like this, like a slingshot, like, you have to pull back to really get momentum to launch forward. And so we had to figure out together, all right, let's take a look at your 4 buckets of pacing, right? So let's look at your cognitive, let's look at your emotional, let's look at your social and your physical. And let's track and kind of balance out what you can tolerate. And it really came down to, even though he wasn't doing a lot of those fun things in his life, right, and had restricted and taken things away, he was still overexerting. And it's so hard for people to think, my gosh, I have to do even less. I've already taken so much away, I have to do less, right? And so we did that. Then we worked on his nutrition, right? To get his metabolic needs up, worked on his breath training, right? Went through this process. And through some of the tracking, we said, okay, so your symptoms are less severe, great. Your crashes aren't as frequent, great. You have a handle on, your nutrition, you have a handle on recovery strategies. Let's try. So we started with some basic aerobic conditioning, which I'll talk about in a second. And we moved through it, and then we hit a roadblock, right? Everything was going great. We were moving through, and then suddenly he started getting worse, right? And so we had to look at, okay, well, what element are we not touching? And in his case, we hadn't fully addressed the mast cell component. So then we had to go back, address that, and then move forward again. And then, he's been progressing through and doing great and phenomenal. And now, he's traveling, he's being able to increase his working hours, doing social events with friends, can even handle a little bit of alcohol here and there, like really feels like, man, okay, like I'm starting to get somewhere and getting back to lifting, which was his big goal. Now, what to look for and what not to, right? So I think the important thing is to understand that you're never going to get to zero pain, zero fatigue before starting to exercise or starting movement, right? If you're waiting for that moment, my gosh, it's never going to come. Okay. So there has to be this understanding that you need to establish a new baseline, meaning that your crashes are farther apart and less severe, that you're living, instead of, this really high roller coaster of, I feel really great, I'm going to do things, and then I feel awful and I'm miserable. And I feel really great, I'm going to do things and awful and miserable. to being in this window where you just have these minor fluctuations that are geared a little bit more towards the middle and you're not spiking all over the place. When you're in that window, that's the sweet spot. That's when your body can maybe handle a little bit of stress, and the important thing is that, everyone thinks that, my gosh, I'm in fight or flight all the time. I need to just get to rest and digest. I need to get to parasympathetic. I need to get there, right? And then they get there, but they can't ever handle the stress again, right? And so you have to eventually add in planned stress, which is movement, exercise, whatever, because it's normal for us to be able to respond to stress, right? And I use this word a lot because stress is so many things. It's conversation, it's socialization, it's movement, it's food, it's all these things, right? It's actually stress on the body, whether it's planned or unplanned. And we need to be able to handle that again, right? So I think the most important thing is finding a window where you're not having those peaks and valleys and crashes is the most important thing. And then when you do decide to start, keeping everything so easy that it doesn't feel like a workout. That is so key. You know what? Like when people say to me, like, I don't feel like I was doing anything, I'll be like, perfect. You did it absolutely right. Perfect. It shouldn't feel like anything, And it should always be sub-symptom threshold. So meaning you should never be really triggering symptoms when you're doing it. That's how easy it should be and look. And I think that's important for people to know.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you are triggering symptoms by what you're doing, then you're doing too much. And we know that threshold is different on different days. So I suppose that there has to be a bit of trial and error because you don't always know on a given day where that threshold is going to be. But I suppose it's like, okay, well, I'll try it. And okay, that's where I stop. And okay, that's different to yesterday, but tomorrow is going to be different still, right?
Yeah.
So I suppose the other bit of this is, the word anxiety is a super sticky word around long COVID. And I have many, many thoughts on this because, anxiety, I think, is a part of long COVID. If you are long-term sick, of course you're going to be freaking anxious. Like, you would be not human if you weren't. But we also know that anxiety then, makes all the other stuff worse. So, it's not that it's causing the long COVID, but it can certainly make it worse. And I think, when we talk about movement and exercise, there's understandably a lot of anxiety around that, especially if you've had bad experiences with it before where you've tried and it's made things worse, or you just haven't done any for like 2 years, then, it's like reintroducing something and that's scary. So how can we kind of balance this out? We know that we're going to be maybe a little bit anxious about it. We know that maybe that isn't going to help, but you can know those two things, but actually stopping yourself from being anxious is a totally different thing. So how do we balance this all out?
Yeah. So honestly, it really comes down to creating safety in the body. So, you're exactly right in the sense that people's preconceived notions or past experiences may influence then when they go to approach exercise, right? And so in some ways, you have to do a little bit of work to create safety in yourself beforehand to ready yourself, But then when you actually do go to do it, more often than not, when I start somebody with exercise, I start them with something so ridiculous that they're asking me, like, is this even worth it? Like I'll say, all right, you're going to do 1 minute of X. And they're like, 1 minute? And I'm like, yes, because the point of it is that you need to get the win under your belt, like the exposure of, I did that thing and it didn't hurt me, so I can do it again. Right. And so that's kind of the whole approach in terms of how I help people through exercise is not, okay, you handled that, let's go to the next level. Oh, you handled that, let's go to the next level. It's let's just keep giving your body the exposure over and over again that you are handling this, that it is safe, And it's so easy that it's not triggering anything, right? And I think that's the most important piece. Now, I do want to add that, I've come across plenty of people who truly are, exercise intolerant. And one of the ways that I've kind of helped people through this is through breath work. And, you and I spoke, there's many different kinds of breath work, right? And there's many different kinds that are not good for this population. But one of the methods that I've gotten certified in and have been found extremely helpful is a method called a reset breath work. And what this is a long form breath work that is designed to help your nervous system, in the sense that you go through this journey of bringing yourself slightly into fight or flight or sympathetic, right? And then dropping yourself back down into a deeper parasympathetic, that ventral vagal state that we all talk about that is so desired. And again, when we think about what exercise does, right? Exercise brings us into sympathetic. And then the normal thing is we're supposed to recover after, right? But with people who have autonomic dysfunction and POTS, they have no problem getting their heart rate up. They have no problem going up. It's that they don't come back down, right? Their body doesn't know how to recover. So then this very little activity is basically as if you're running a marathon all day, even though you've stopped doing that thing, right? And so what I found is that with people who couldn't tolerate traditional exercise, couldn't have that recovery, I was able to find that way through doing the reset breath work, where you have a lot more control in kind of bringing yourself up or towing the line, and then bring yourself back into that recovery mode, which I think has opened up a lot of people's nervous systems to then eventually be able to handle more exercise. Anyone who listens to this podcast at any point, if you end up going to my website, then using the code breathe100, then I would love to have anyone try the breath work, the reset breath work, for free, just because I think it's important for people to have access to more things.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been really informative and really fun. So what we're going to actually do is a follow-up quite soon, where we talk a little bit more into the sort of practical aspect of this. What do I do? How do I know? So we'll go a little bit more in depth into that very soon. So do look out for that. All of the links will go into the show notes, anything that we've mentioned. And yeah, thank you so much, Meg. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you so much to all of my guests, and to you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found it useful. The Long COVID podcast is entirely self-produced and self-funded. I'm doing all of this myself. If you're able to, please go to buymeacoffee.com/LongCovidPod to help me cover the costs of hosting the podcast. Please look out for the next episode of the Long COVID podcast. It's available on all the usual podcast hosting things. And do get in touch. I'd love to hear from you.